All right. Our last presenter is Dr. Charles Anthony Stewart. Dr. Charles Anthony Stewart is an art historian and archaeologist. He specializes in the development of late Roman and early medieval architecture, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean region and Central Asia. In general, his research investigates traditional periods of history as well as artistic, technological, and economic exchange between neighboring cultures. These interests have led him to study the global development of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. His publications have explored the development of classical Greek and Roman art and its continuity and adaptation into the early Middle Ages. Over the past 5 years, he has been working with a team of archaeologists exploring the first Christian communities in Western China and Kazakhstan, where they have recently excavated an early church and cemetery. Now, this morning, I learned that he has a secret. He is playing the bagpipes. How this interferes with this presentation, I'm not sure, but his title is Early Christian Art in Southwest Turkey. Please, Charles.
So I'm going to set a timer so I don't go over, because I can speak on this all day, so we don't want to do that. So let me go ahead and start this. Thank you, all of you, for hanging with us to the very end here. All of you online, thank you for all being there, watching from your monitors. I wanted to extend my thanks to lasierra University. Every time I come here, I'm just blown away. I'm just fascinated by the high quality scholarship that the professors here provide the students and the wonderful students that you form here at this college, that you have this wonderful balance between matters of faith and matters of reason, just like Professor Bramlett has just shared with us today. Okay, so here's my presentation. It's up. Let me delve into it. So today I thought I would start with one of the earliest saints that you already heard about, St. Philip in Hieropolis, and then I would end with one of the later saints from the 4th century, which is St. Nicholas, who also comes from southwestern Turkey. All right, now first of all, I thought I should say a few things about chronology, because most of you have heard lectures here regarding the Near East, and sometimes the chronology is not exactly the same. So we have these dates here that are secular dates, and we use these terms: early empire, high empire, late antiquity. These are all terms that art historians use to label the kind of art that we see being produced during these time periods. And these are usually defined stylistically by how the artwork looks. And then we have the early Byzantine period. Now, Israeli archaeologists, because it's slightly different, they tend to say early Byzantine starts around the year 300, when Constantinople is founded. So the city of Byzantium is founded as Constantinople, and that begins the early Byzantine period. But in Turkey, or when we work in other parts of the Mediterranean, we tend to say that is the early Christian period, and early Byzantine starts much later during the time of around Justinian the Great. Now, am I doing that? I hope I'm not doing that. So let me just, here we go. So you should also know, so this is the secular history. Let's go back. And then we have the religious theological history that coincides with this Roman secular history. So what we call the early empire is really the apostolic age, where the time of the apostles. And then you have the time of the ante-Nicene fathers, the early church fathers, we tend to call them. And then you have the time of the church councils. And then you have the early Byzantine period that defines what happens from the 6th century to the 15th century. And you should know that one of these great movements in history is the Great Schism between the Eastern-speaking church and the Greek-speaking church of the East and the Western Latin-speaking church. All right, so we just talked about time. Let's say a little bit about space. Just to review, you've seen lots of maps this weekend. We have to transport ourselves back in time from modern-day Turkey to the 1st century. So these are some of the cities we've talked about. All these, most of these cities are mentioned in the New Testament, and but you have to travel back in the 1st century. Each of these areas were known by their regional names, whether it's Lycia and Pamphylia or Caria. And so just a few things you should know about early Christian art. Now, not much early Christian art survives from this region compared to other places around the Mediterranean. There's several reasons for this. As you could tell from the other lectures you heard this weekend, this region had a very productive, very productive workshops in manufacturing ancient art. And so the citizens prided themselves in the great idols that they built and the great churches that the great temples that they constructed. And they had wonderful sources of marble in places such as Caria and the Proconnesos, around the Sea of Marmara, and you had all the Greek islands, like the island of Paros, that produced marble. So you had great resources to create marble statues, and people took pride in their pagan idols. Of course, Jews and Christians did not believe in idolatry, so they moved away from that tradition, and that's why we don't have a lot of early Christian art. But there is a few that survive, which I will highlight in this lecture. So the majority of Christians, when we do find Christian art, it tends to be geometrical, and they tend to avoid figural imagery because they don't want to be associated with paganism. So we also think by the year 1100, you had Turkish tribes that moved into the area. They seem to have destroyed many of the artworks that may have existed. And we know that a lot of churches were either turned into mosques, possibly, or abandoned, but definitely churches were no longer built at this time. So I'm just going to highlight a few examples. All right, first, I thought I should share with you some of the earliest epigraphical images that we have that we think may be Christian. So for example, in Phrygia, there is actually there's a site called Apamea where we have some of the earliest coins that contains Jewish imagery. Some of you might have seen these before. This is a coin of Septimius Severus, dating from around the year 200. And on one side, you have the bust of Septimius Severus. On the other side, you have an image of Noah's Ark. So we can read these inscriptions here. On the one side, where you have a box, underneath, on top of the box, it actually says Noah. And the city of Apamea was also known as Kabodos. Kabodos in Greek means box. And so there was this interesting connection, apparently, that the Jews living in Apamea connecting themselves with the descendants of Noah. It shows us that even before Constantine's Edict of Toleration in the year 312, that you have this rising Jewish population in southwestern Turkey, and you start to see this biblical imagery starting to be developed. And so what you have here is sort of Noah on the outside of the ark with his wife. You have the dove above them with the olive leaf, and then you have a couple of Noah's sons inside the ark. So it's an interesting development. So this is one of the earliest hints that we have starting a sort of Jewish and then later Christian iconography. And then this tradition continues. So this is a coin for 100 years later where we see the same image of Noah and the box. So the ark looks like a box here. All right, let's move on from this. We also have one of these interesting inscriptions that predate the legalization of Christianity that mentions a person named Avaricius. And in this inscription, we can date it to the time of Marcus Aurelius. And according to tradition, this bishop named Avaricius wrote a letter to Marcus Aurelius. We also know that he wrote a book called the Book of Discipline. That book doesn't survive, but we do know he wrote this book. And this inscription here dates from the year 167. Now, in the life of Avaricius, it talks about him traveling to Nisibis in Syria, also traveling to Rome to visit the churches there. And this inscription actually also mentions him traveling to Nisibis as well as Rome. This inscription talks about him as a disciple, that he's a disciple to a holy shepherd who feeds his sheep. This language here is not a pagan. This is not something you will find on pagan imagery. This is something that is unique and seems to be indicating Christianity. He travels to Rome, and it's described on this inscription here. Also, it talks about him when he's traveling, he eats fish of incredible size, which is a really odd thing to talk about on an inscription here. Once again, we think this is a cryptic reference to Christianity and the symbolism of the ichthus. So we know from Augustine that the ichthus was an acronym for a kind of early creed, where the term fish in Greek can stand for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. And here that ichthus inscribed here may be reference to this early type of creed. Also, at the end of the inscription, it describes him drinking wine of great virtue mingled with red, which seems to be indicating what the Christians practiced at the time. When they would gather together, they would have the agape meal or the love meal, where they would remember Christ, what we call communion today. So this is a reconstruction of this inscription. And so this is outside this is one of the earliest inscriptions anywhere that seems to have been recording Christianity outside the New Testament documents. So that's why having this conference in Southwest Turkey is so important, because we have some of this early epigraphy. Here's another piece of evidence that many scholars believe is a good indication of Christianity before the legalization in the year 312. When we look at this inscription, the inscription itself gives us a year, and it doesn't mention any of the pagan deities, which is kind of odd for a pagan funeral tombstone. But look at in this person's hand here. I'm going to highlight it here. Notice in his what is his left hand, he has a bunch of grapes, and then in his right hand, he has some kind of disc that has a cross on it. And so we tend to interpret this as a symbol of communion. You have the fruit of the vine, the grapevine, and then you have the bread of the agape meal, of the Eucharistic feast. And so a lot of scholars, and now we can't be sure, but we wouldn't assume that Christians would publicly display their faith, because it was illegal and they could be persecuted. So it's in these sort of cryptic, ambiguous images that we kind of can flesh out that these are Christians wanting to manifest their faith visually, but not being so conspicuous as to be persecuted by the Roman authorities. Here's a later funerary inscription that dates after the legalization of Christianity, and there's references to Christianity in this inscription here. This also comes from Phrygia. Notice you have the wreath, and Dr. Wilson has showed us the use of wreaths. And so let me just complement his lecture. Remember, in the book of James, it mentions anyone who endures temptation, such a one will inherit the crown of life. And so the laurel wreath is, in a way, pagan imagery that comes from the sporting events. But you keep in mind that the laurel itself comes from an evergreen type of shrub, an evergreen tree. And so during the year when other trees lose their leaves, they look like they die. The evergreen, the laurel leaves continue to be green. And so that becomes a symbol of everlasting. So what is evergreen is everlasting. It can be a symbol of life. And so This time of year, you'll see people hang these wreaths on their doors here at La Sierra. It's optional if you do that or not. But this is a long tradition that the wreath, of course, no one's going to walk around with this on their head as a crown of life, but this is the symbolism here. The idea evergreen is a symbol of everlasting life. So let's not forget it when we see these things around us this time of year. Now, the inscription itself here, onto the side here, it says, God has sealed in his keeping for me, his child, mortal as I am. I have found a place in the immortal bosom of Abraham. I am a servant of God. I dwell in paradise. This is an overtly Christian formula, and it's referencing, Jesus's parable of Lazarus and the rich man, right, where the Lazarus is near Abraham's bosom, right? So you see this development of Christianity, which is sort of still being persecuted, and now you have here Christianity that is free to express itself with the legalization that takes place in the year 312. All right, so I also thought I should mention some things about Hieropolis. Now, once again, Dr. Wilson has already provided us a really good introduction to Hieropolis. Let me say a few more things about it for you. So this is kind of like a review. Here's an image of Hieropolis. We should know that its name means the sacred city, the holy city. You can also interpret this as the city of priests. Here is a view of the main street going into Hieropolis from skydiving. And here is the downtown or the cultural area. And we saw the Plutonion. They actually found the statue of Pluto or Hades here, which is now in the museum. And they put a plaster cast of Pluto here. And this is sort of the gateway to the underworld. Now, what's interesting is beside this, well, this is a reconstruction that the Italian archaeologists have made, how they envision this temple have looked. It had these sacred pools. All those areas that look like steps were actually seats where people would come and sit around this pool waiting for the oracle to come out of this gateway to Hades or the gateway to hell. They would come out and prophesy, and people would sit around here to hear these prophecies, these oracles. So beside that is the temple to Apollo. And then beyond here, you can see the theater, which, well, many people don't know this, but all theaters were temples to Dionysus. And so you have these three deities worshipped here. That's why it was called the Holy City or the Sacred City. You have Pluto under the god of the underworld. You have Dionysus, the god of the terrestrial world, and then you have Apollo, the god of the celestial world. And so you have this paganism that infiltrates from the underworld to the terrestrial world to the celestial world. And every part of society is permeated by paganism. And one of the things we've seen in this conference this weekend is this transition to Christianity. How did these people who were so steeped in their religion, where everything is permeated by paganism, how could they just abandon their old traditions for this new faith? And this is why archaeology in this region is so fascinating, because we can chart this taking place here. So here's a view of this, the theater. I'm not going to say much about it. It's rather well preserved. So here's the map. So these are the locations of the Plutonian and the Roman theater. Let me say a few things about the Apostle Philip, who comes here. According to his life, which is not recorded in the New Testament, but it comes from later tradition. Well, let me just say a few things about what the scriptures say about Apostle Philip. We know he comes from Bethsaida, and that's exactly where Peter and Andrew come from. And so in a way, you can imagine, we don't know for sure, but maybe Philip was a childhood friend of Peter and Andrew. And we know that when Jesus fed the 5,000 from the Gospel of John, that it was Philip who Jesus commands to feed the 5,000 to help him. So Philip is the assistant to Christ. And then we have during the Lord's Supper, as it's described in the Gospel of John, Philip says to Jesus, "Jesus, show us the Father." And of course, we know from the Gospel of John, Jesus says, I am the Father and one. So Jesus, by being there, is showing them the Father. So it is the faith of Philip that, in a way, he is testifying to his experience with Jesus when he comes to Hieropolis, if that is the same Philip who is buried here. That's his testimony that he's telling the people. And according to a later tradition, he actually preaches the gospel here, and the proconsul's wife converts to Christianity, which angers the proconsul. And so he has Philip sentenced to death, and he is crucified upside down. Okay. And that might explain why the martyrium is a cruciform shape, and that is the place that marks where he was executed. So this is the plan that we saw yesterday, and it's interesting because this is a first century necropolis, and this is a necropolis is a cemetery, a Roman cemetery, and that's exactly where we find the tomb of Philip. And so the archaeology supports that tradition. And so I'm not going to go into this too much here, but you can see the layout of this particular area outside the city walls. Now, in the Roman period, it was illegal to bury the dead inside the city walls. So this is exactly what we would expect on an archaeological standpoint. All right, let me just go through this. What's interesting also about the site is you have the aqueduct that cuts through the area, but underneath the martyrium, as well as underneath the later church, you have all these cisterns, you have all these pipes, and the pilgrims who would come here, we believe, had some kind of ritual bathing connected to the veneration of remembrance of Philip. And so, this is the archaeologist Francesco de Andrea discovered in 2011 the actual tomb of Saint Philip, which is a first century type of tomb, and built embedded within the church. We have other tombs around Hieropolis that have a menorah dating from the 1st to 2nd centuries. So it testifies to a Jewish community here in Hieropolis, where Philip most likely was bringing the gospel message to. He was targeting the Jewish population here. And so we saw this reconstruction yesterday. You have the phase 1 tomb here. And then you have the phase 2 tomb that has a building built around it to preserve it. So it's almost like a museum that they're building a structure to preserve this first century tomb that they remember after 200 years that this is where Philip was buried. And then later on, around the year 400, they built the martyrium, remembering the place where he was killed, not too far away from where he was buried. And this, you can see this is a cruciform layout of the martyrium itself. And the area, this would have been a place venerating, maybe some of the relics were placed here, but we tend to interpret this as the place where he himself experienced martyrdom. And so notice the plan of this building. Notice around the core of this structure, you have all these rooms. So they're like hotel rooms for pilgrims to come here to stay. It's kind of like today, many Christians go camping, they go on retreats, and so they have a place to stay, they have a place to sleep, and during the day, they hear messages, they have workshops. You can imagine that this was a very similar place. I also think this was also a kind of like a hospital, that a lot of people who go on pilgrimage are often sick and their bodies are aching. And so they come, this is not only a place of pilgrimage, but also a place of healing, like a hospital. And so this too kind of reminds me of Asclepion, which was ancient places where people would go to find healing from the god Asclepius. And so in a way, this is a sort of Christian conversion of an Asclepion. So the practice of people coming here to worship Pluto and Apollo and Dionysus is replaced by the veneration of Philip, who testifies to Jesus Christ. All right, let's move on from here. So here are some of the marble carvings around the site for the capitals that supported the roof. We saw this bread stamp yesterday. I just wanted to once again highlight, so the back, this is the way the back looks here. and it looks like a coin, but it's actually a stamp. And you can stamp a piece of dough, and this image will be imprinted on the dough, and that's why it's written backwards. You see, we have the martyrium here, and then we have the tomb here. They're both places of visitation by pilgrims. And that's what we exactly see in the archaeology. So what you have here is the artifact resembling the geographical space. Also, the inscription says it's St. Philip, Holy Philip, and then it has an inscription from Isaiah. All right, we saw that yesterday. And so this earlier image of that we interpret as Christian with a person holding a piece of bread seems to be coming from this, the bread stamp on the left is coming from this earlier tradition of bread becoming a symbol of Christian worship and remembrance of Christ. All right. Also, we know that pilgrims are coming to Hieropolis because there's all these pilgrim flasks that have been discovered. This looks very similar to the pilgrim ampulla that we saw from Ephesus yesterday that had images of St. John on them. Here we have images of Philip. They look exactly the same, but pilgrims would come here. They would take these souvenirs home with them. What was placed in some of these flasks, we're not really sure. Oil, maybe fruit of the vine, grape juice, wine, possibly water, holy water was kept in these flasks. Like I said, there was all these cisterns and aqueducts running through the martyrium. So it's possible they had founts where they would bless the water. Later, these come from later periods, from the early Byzantine period. Clearly, pilgrims manifested their faith by wearing pendants, showing the image of the cross. Some of these crosses show an image of Christ, so they're crucifixes. Others, like the one number 3 here, says the word light and life, they're intertwined. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And you have that saying here on the cross. All right, let's move on. We also have images of ostraca or ostracons. Here, it seems that pilgrims were etching prayers onto these sherds of pottery. Archaeologists, we find sherds all the time. They're just trash, but if they have inscriptions on them, they're more than just trash. They're notebook paper that they used in ancient times. This inscription says here, Saint Apostle of Christ, we assume it's Philip, of heaven, remember me. So asking the saint to intercede for them, the idea that the saint is in heaven, they can intercede on your behalf. All right, also I thought I should share with you something about the downtown cathedral. After Christianity is legalized, we start to see the development of churches in the 4th century, and then we start to see many churches being built in the late Roman period. So this is the Christian cathedral downtown near the Agora, and you can see, let me go back here. What you see here is the atrium leading into the church, so the forecourt. And then here you see the seats, what we call a synthronon, or the throne of people ruling together. The idea that the clergy are sort of equals amongst each other, sitting together. And you can see how, if you're a clergy, you'd be looking out on your congregation from this vantage point. Notice how the synthronon looks a lot like the theater. This is not an accident. The idea is that you have a seating arrangement. And of course, in ancient times, they would have made these connections. Now, what I find interesting is that the number of seats that are in the church, number 9, and that 9 is symbolic. In the book of Acts, it mentions how a person in the Areopagus in Athens heard the teaching of Paul and converted to Christianity. And so one of the disciples of Paul was known as Saint Denis. And according to Byzantine tradition, one of the Denis, actually, or Dionysus, Saint Dionysus, he actually writes a book called the Celestial Hierarchy, where he talks about the 9 orders of angels. And so what we find in the church, you have these 9 seats. And so he also writes a book called the Ecclesiastical Hierarchy. And so you start to see this emulation of the church officials emulating the hierarchy of the angels. And so you have this connection between the two. Now, this is a much later tradition dating from the 6th century, but in the 6th century, They thought it was a first century tradition. And you can see how these ideas permeate from the classical tradition all the way to the Middle Ages. So once again, remember the word hierarchy, we use it all the time in English. It means the rule of the sacred. So when you hear our government officials talking about the hierarchy of the White House, they're using this term, this religious language we inherit from the classical period. All right, and so the cathedral here, these are my plans. I've been studying this cathedral for a while now. These are some of the plans of the early church here that dates from around the year 400. No doubt there was an earlier structure underneath here. Most likely that early structure was a, excuse me here. That early structure was a probably a house that was located around this area, and it was later converted to a church. What happens around the year 500? We know that one of the rituals that took place was the washing of the feet, and that took place in the narthex of the church, and it seems to have been expanded to the south so they can facilitate the washing of the feet, where the bishop would humble himself and wash the feet of the people. And then later on, around the year 600, the apse area was fortified, most likely because of seismic activity in the region. Going back to the year 400, you have this interesting tomb that's inside the city walls that's located here. That's why I think this is a later church rather than an earlier one, because you have a tomb here, most likely of a high-ranking official or a saint that was located here. And there's a pipe that leads into the tomb, which is most likely for libation. And so we know from paganism, people would pour wine or olive oil on top of graves to honor the dead. Well, Christians continue that practice to honor the dead. In a way, they convert the pagan practice for Christian purpose. It's a type of honoring the dead. Right, so here's some of the remnants of the architectural decoration within this church here. Here it has an inscription that says, "In God's sacred churches." We also have this sort of galoche pattern. Notice you have this, what we call an almond rosette in the middle of this pattern here. We tend to interpret this as like a flower. I just published an article where I make the argument that are actually meant to be stars. And we see this pattern all throughout the Mediterranean. It starts in Greece and it works its way all the way into China. It's one of the most, so whenever Chinese archaeologists find the rosette pattern, they say it's foreign. It comes from the West. Here's an image of St. John the Baptist. I think this is evidence of later Turks coming through here and maybe damaging some of the images where his nose is broken. I think this is deliberate breaking of the images. Right. In terms of the way the people lived in Hieropolis, you have a courtyard house, very similar to the houses we saw in Ephesus yesterday. This is an image of a reconstruction of a house from Pergamon, very similar. This is the way Christians would live. These are the kinds of houses that they would have lived in. In this courtyard, they also found a lead seal, most likely of one of the bishops here. And on one side, you have a symbol of the Apostle Philip. On the other side, you have an image of the Archangel Michael. And so it's this idea that they remember that Philip was here, and then he appointed his disciples to take care of the church. And from age to age, generation to generation, the monuments, the monumental building, they remember the history of their faith. All right, how much time do I have left? I've lost my track of time. 4 minutes. Okay, let me, to finish this up, I won't get to St. Nicholas today, but let me share with you some of the greatest works of art that comes from the early Christian period that come from Turkey. Now, these marble statues are actually today in the Cleveland Museum of Art, but we believe they come from Phrygia, the area of southwest Turkey. And so these are some of the earliest Christian artworks that survive that predates the year 312 when Christianity was legalized. And so what we have here is an image of Jonah being swallowed by the great fish. Now you might say, well, that doesn't look like a fish. Well, if you know your Bible, you know that the Greek Old Testament was, according to tradition, translated in Alexandria. And the word that they use for the big fish in the Greek Septuagint is kite. And if you know Greek mythology, it is the the Ketos was the monster that Perseus slays to save Andromeda from the sea monster. And so Christians are interpreting the Hebrew Old Testament. They don't know what this story is about. And so they're reinterpreting it based upon a Hellenistic or Greek understanding of what the Bible is saying. And so the Ketos was the sea monster that Perseus slays. So here's an image of Perseus slaying the Ketos, which sort of has a dog's head, has wings, it has these sort of forepaws. And so that's how the Christians are interpreting this image. So here you have another sequence, another part of this sculptural composition where Jonah is being vomited out by the great fish. Now, I should mention this sculpture was discovered in 1963, and it was actually in a big pithoi. So all these sculptures were together. It seems to be hidden. We don't know exactly where. It's pretty shady where the sculpture comes from, but it is authentic. What's interesting, when I visit this sculpture in Cleveland, as I walk around the sculpture, the way the light plays around the figure, it almost looks like it's moving, like it's in the water, all the sort of flickering light. There's a kind of kinetic energy in this type of sculpture. It really is a masterpiece. And then you have another scene where Jonah, after preaching to the Ninevites, he goes off into the desert and he's kind of sulking because he wanted God to destroy the Ninevites, and they repent instead. And so God saves them. So he goes out in the desert, and as he's sort of sulking there, wanting to die, God caused a vine to grow up over his head, and that's what you see here: Jonah under the gourd, the vine, and then later, God destroys the vine. But here you have him in his state of repose. What's interesting is that the back here was carved away, was not carved, so it looks like it was intended to be up against something. And I interpret this as it being put against a lamp, because when you shine a light through it, you can see how marble itself is translucent. Light shines through the marble. And you have this beautiful, what we call in art history, chiaroscuro, the light and dark, that high contrast between the two. Once again, they understand nature, they understand the properties of light. What's interesting also is that it seems that the artist here probably was a pagan who didn't know the story very well. And so he's adopting themes that we find in other pagan works of art. So this is a sarcophagus that shows the moon goddess Selene and Endymion. I'm not going to go and tell you that story because I'm running out of time, but here you have an image of Endymion here. Notice the way he's posed down here. Notice if we compare him to Jonah, they look a lot alike. So this might indicate that there was these ancient pattern books. And so when a Christian went to this pagan and said, could you sculpt to me this image of Jonah and the whale? And this pagan didn't know the story of Jonah and the whale. And so the Christian described it to him. And so the sculptor just takes these images from a pattern book and adopts them. In a way, he converts them for Christian use. And then the final image in the sequence is the image of Jonah himself. What we call this stance the Iran stance. This is how the pagans would pray with their hands up like this. And this is converted to Christian use. And Christians pray this way. You go to Eastern Orthodox churches or Armenian churches, they pray this way. And so Jonah here is praying. And this is the way he looks in the back. Once again, if you turn the statue around, it's interesting, almost looks like he's moving based upon the shadows and the shading and the light fixing on him. So what we have here is a continuous narrative. You have a beginning, a middle, and an end of the story, the sequence. And it's very possible that the artist was also maybe looking at illuminated manuscripts where you can flip the page. Maybe a illustrated Bible had existed even before the legalization of Christianity, where these images come from. Because there's a fifth image here, and this fifth image is the image of a good shepherd, which is an interesting image here. And we don't interpret this as a portrait of Christ, but a kind of symbol of Christ as the Good Shepherd. And of course, in the book of John, this scripture, Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd. And so it's all right for Christians to show the symbol of Jesus as a Good Shepherd because Jesus uses this term for himself. And so notice the back of Jesus here, he has this purse. Now there was a book in the 2nd century written by a guy in Rome called Hermas, and he talks about how Jesus appeared to him with a glorious clothes, dressed like a shepherd, with white goat skin, a wallet on his back, and a rod in his hand. And we think this image is also taken from this description from this 2nd century book. Now, Hermas himself was actually a Roman slave who was freed, and he was the brother of one of these bishops of Rome, the 10th bishop of Rome, according to tradition. All right, so the reason why this is important is notice the similarity between Jonah and Jesus. They're wearing the same kind of clothing. They're wearing the same kind of boots. They're standing in what we call the contrapositive stance. One leg is bent, one leg is holding him up. And if we turn them around, they're both wearing this sort of backpack, the shepherd's purse. And this is not an accident. Why is there a comparison between Jesus and Jonah here? Well, it's because Jesus compares himself to Jonah. So Jesus says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks a sign, but no sign shall be given them except for the sign of the prophet Jonah. For Jonah was in 3 days and nights in the belly of the whale, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And so Jesus is making this comparison. Now, in theology, we call this prefiguration and typology. So Jesus is the archetype, Jonah is the type, or because Jesus comes after Jonah, because Jesus is the antitype as well. And so it's an interesting it's taking scripture and interpreting it visually in a Greco-Roman context. What's interesting is Turkey is one of the main places that we see this image of the Good Shepherd. It's shown over and over and over again. Really quickly, do I have a couple of minutes? Okay, really quickly. So one of the earliest images of the Good Shepherd comes from Hieropolis in Syria. And in the house church, or the Domus Ecclesia here, we have in the back of the baptistry, let me just go through here, we have another image of the Good Shepherd. So once again, in Syria and Turkey, we have some of the earliest images of the Good Shepherd before the legalization of Christianity. And it shows that this is an early tradition, even before it was legal to express one's faith, that Christians wanted to express their faith visually. And so here's the close-up of that image in the baptistry at Hieropolis. Here on the sarcophagus in Rome, we have the same theme. Jonah being swallowed by the great fish vomiting Jonah. And then notice here, who's that? A guy in a box and a dove above his head. Well, this is Noah. This is the same image we saw on that coin. And then up here, you have Jonah reclining underneath the vine. And then up here, we have an image of the Good Shepherd. Notice how the sheep are coming out of a tomb that looks a lot like the tomb of Philip. I think all this imagery actually comes from Asia Minor. There's a debate amongst our historians. Do early Christian art come from Rome, or does it come from the Orient or to Rome? There's a famous Austrian art historian named Josef Strzkowski, and he made this argument that it came from the East. And I think archaeology nowadays is confirming that idea. Some of the earliest Christian art comes from the East, and Rome adopts it from the East. Where I think this is a good place for me to end. I would love to tell you more. I could go on all day, but feel free to ask me any questions at the end. And if you need any of the sources that I'm using here, feel free to email me. I have a big bibliography on this material that I can send to you, especially all of you students. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Any questions? We're about to close, but does anybody have a question? We have a couple over here. Let me make my way this way. Don, and we have something from Don also. Let me get somebody back here first. Just a minute.
Do these artifacts, are they carbon dated?
The artifact?
Are the artifacts carbon dated?
So the image like Jonah, you can't carbon date marble, but what you can do is try to find where that marble comes from. So the marble has been tested. It seems to come from the region of Asia Minor, and it most likely was sculpted in Asia Minor. Now the date that I'm giving, the year 290, is a date that art historians, there's a consensus amongst art historians, whether they're religious or not, they think stylistically it fits in the late 3rd century.
Ah, I see.
Yes.
Thank you.
Regarding Philip's tomb, were there actually human remains interred there, or was it just monumental?
So that's a good question. So the archaeologists found no human remains in Philip's tomb. Okay. So there's a tradition in the Byzantine Empire of taking the relics of saints from around the Byzantine Empire and bringing them to the Church of the Holy Apostles in Byzantium or Constantinople. There's a big church called the Church of the Holy Apostles, and all the relics of all the apostles was placed there. And then later on, it becomes a mosque. And so there's a big mosque there today where that church used to be. But the archaeologists working there did not find any human bones in that tomb.
Well, to follow up on that, sorry, the relics that were housed there, what happened to those when it became a mosque?
That's a good question. We don't know. There's a recent book published by Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. that talks about the history of the Church of the Holy Apostles. What happened to those relics? The answer is we don't know. There's a tradition by Muslims to sell off Christian relics for whatever reason. So throughout Europe, you will find relics of saints, and maybe some of those come from that Church of the Holy Apostles. We don't know for sure.
Okay, one more question here.
How the pagan culture metamorphosed, like you mentioned, the Apollo was celestial, Dionysus was terrestrial, and Pluto was this. And what fascinates me though is the like the Lydian and the because I'm thinking of the modes in the ancient chants and how that evolved into like Gregorian chant. It's hard enough to find visual fragments, and that how these, like the Good Shepherd, and it came from Syria, and how. But is there anybody working? Is there any remains or any relics of the different modes? Because Beethoven wrote the Heilige Dankgesang, the Thanksgiving, in the Lydian mode of a convalescence, and it's kind of like the wellspring of Western civilization, and we're pulling all these elements that are synthesizing, and it's so
Yeah, so there are music historians who are working on these questions. How did these musical scales develop from the Lydian and the Phrygian scale that we still use today? I try to play my bagpipes in the Phrygian scale. It's not easy to do, but there's this long tradition. A lot of the architecture we see on our campus here at La Sierra University that comes from the Greek and Roman period. The columns that we see here, the sort of post and lintel construction, what we call the trabeative system, we find that here. So there's the things that we have today, we inherited from the past, and those things come way, way back to ancient times. And yes, that's what the whole business of archaeology and history is all about, tracing those origins. Yeah.
Thank you, Charles. It would be really, yes, let's thank him. I think it would be fun if we could put all of the presenters up here and take a half an hour and ask them all questions and let them ask each other questions, because they're working in a similar geographical region. So you have one comment, one question?
A comment.
Okay.
No, to you. Is it not possible, if people want to ask questions, to direct them to the center?
Sure.
And then they will be passed on.
Sure.
And yeah.
Thank you. Of course, we'll be happy to do that. So let me thank all of the presenters. I mean, this has been a terrific 2 days of presentations. So we want to thank you again and are very appreciative of your contribution. I also want to thank our on-site and our online audiences. This experiment, we assume, will continue, given the fact that face-to-face is so rewarding and it's so important to be here. But at the same time, not everybody can do that. And we now have this global reach, which is extremely exciting to all of us. Two things I want to say. One is that the Bedouin tent is once again open for refreshments, so you're certainly welcome to make your way over there. And then finally, next year on the 12th and 13th of November, Archaeology Weekend, the 14th annual version, will be on the Pharaohs. That is still taking some shape, but it will be on Egypt and on the Pharaohs and should be extremely exciting. We are thinking about and working toward engaging a number of stakeholders and partners in the Inland Empire to make that weekend special. Thank you again all for coming.